I'm going to talk about women's voting rights in the United States, about the facts and what is false. Most of what you hear about women voting, the history of women voting in the United States, is false. It's not true. They say that they were denied the right to vote in the United States until the 19th Amendment. It's not true. It's not factually correct. And I'm basing this on research that I've done on the internet, a lot of it coming from Wikipedia, some of it coming from YouTube. And I'm going to tell you what I've learned reading about women's voting history. First of all, we're going to go back through the history of mankind. Most of the history of mankind was ruled by kings and queens and emperors and churches, religions, and tribes and things like that. Nobody had a right to vote anywhere. Everybody was either a serf or a slave. Nobody had the right to own property. That was 99% of people. There was no such thing as voting. The right to vote existed among senators and legislatures in Rome and maybe in Greece. But in general, people didn't vote. It wouldn't work. It didn't make sense. It's better to have a king. People don't know what's going on. There was no media. They didn't know. Anything that they knew was old news. If you knew that there was a war going on, you knew the old news, spreading word of mouth. For example, part of the Civil War continued after the war was over. They were still fighting. They still fought battles because they didn't get the news that the war was over. People didn't know what was going on. They didn't know the decisions that people were making. They were not affected. People lived on farms outside the city. They didn't know other people. They met few other people. That's what life on a farm is. They didn't know what was going on with the king. They didn't know what decisions he was making. They didn't know who the rulers, they knew who the rulers were. There was a lot of ambiguity if you were in an outlying area where you don't know who the ruler is because there's more than one ruler, or there's no one. So there was no reason to vote. There was nothing to vote for. You can't vote a king out of office. What are you going to vote for? You're going to vote for the right to what? You lived on your farm and you grew food. You know, taxation might be something that affected you. But people didn't have money, so they couldn't be taxed. Their food could be taken away from them. That's pretty much the only thing that could be taken away from you for most people, was food, if you lived on a farm. It didn't make sense to vote. People didn't know what was going on. The laws didn't affect them. Didn't make sense. It would have been impractical. You had to travel a long distance. You might have had to walk for all day, pay money for food at a restaurant that you didn't have, stay in a hotel that you couldn't afford, not know where the polling place is, not know what the issues were, not know who the candidates were, not know who was running, not know their platforms. You would go in not knowing anything and then have to walk back home, leaving your children behind. Your wife isn't going to go with you. She's going to stay home and take care of the kids. And nobody's going to say, let's both go vote, because if the wife votes for one person and the husband votes for the other, nobody is going to be insane enough to spend money and walk all day and walk home so that their vote doesn't count because their spouse votes the opposite. You know, it was an insane belief. The husband and wife were considered one. They don't vote separately. Only one person needed to vote. You know, the modern society is different. What applies in a modern voting, I'm not going to tell you what they are because you already know, did not apply in the history of mankind. Now, and this is my own beliefs. I didn't read this on the internet. This is me thinking this is the way it was. So now you've got a democracy, the United States, where they created the Electoral College, and it was the right thing to do. For all the reasons that I explained, people don't know what's going on, so you have a person who represents you, who you probably still don't know. Unless you're really lucky, you're not going to know. And there were very little newspapers at the time, and people couldn't read. There was no radio and no TV, so people didn't vote. The Electoral College was the right solution. And in fact, the first 20 presidents, up to Abraham Lincoln, including Abraham Lincoln, I don't think people voted for him. It was just the Electoral College. He was elected with like 200 votes. You can look up this information. The average person, I don't think, actually went to a polling place to vote for president. I don't think it happened until around the 20th president. Around the 20th president, there's poll data that says that people went to polls and voted for the president. I might be wrong. I did see one piece of data somewhere which shows poll data that suggested that people may have voted for like George Washington and Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, but I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. It defeats the purpose of having an electoral college. If people were voting directly, then you wouldn't have the electoral college. So I'm not sure. You should research this on your own. But again, the population in general, even if they did have the right to walk somewhere to vote, they just didn't do it. They didn't care. I already explained the reasons why. It didn't affect them. They weren't literate. They didn't know who was campaigning. List goes on and on. You're not going to go with your wife and have her vote the opposite of you and spend all that money and time doing it. It was insane. People would never have thought to do that. You're not going to leave your... Well, I guess they would have to leave their wife behind. Okay, so let's move on. So now around maybe the 1880s, people were voting. There was a property requirement. And the reason why you have a property requirement is because you want people to vote because they have a vested interest in the area where they were voting. They would own property, they lived there. If they were a foreigner or they didn't own property, you don't go to another state and vote for what's going to happen in another state. You still can't do that. But now they have a residency requirement. Before it was property. You established residency. Their residency requirement was owning property. A person who rented did not have a right to vote. He did not establish his residency requirement because they did not want outsiders interfering with their elections. Just as you don't want Russians to decide an American election, you don't want someone from Virginia deciding the election in New York. You had to own property and live there. Two people are not necessary for property ownership. You only need one. You know, it's true that you have joint ownership, but they didn't grant the right to vote to two people. Maybe they did. The laws were different in every state, and the laws were stupid in most of the states. Many states did not have laws restricting women from voting. It wasn't true. There were laws in the history of this country at the state level or maybe at the local level restricting women from voting, but it wasn't a blanket, all women were prohibited in every state from the beginning of this country until the 19th Amendment. Not true. There were isolated areas where one state might have a law, and it might be for a certain period of time. It might be tied to property ownership, etc. So it's not true that it was universal, women couldn't vote. The law in New Jersey was every inhabitant of the state of New Jersey had the right to vote. That was the law. Now, as I said, the country was new, and they made a lot of mistakes writing laws. There were a lot of stupid laws because they didn't know what they were doing. It was being done for the first time. They made mistakes. The New Jersey law, all inhabitants of the state of New Jersey had the right to vote, meant that prisoners could vote, elderly people could vote, handicapped people could vote, foreigners could vote because they're an inhabitant of the state. People under the age of 18 could vote because they were inhabitants of the state. People that were in a coma could vote. People who suffered from mental retardation, who lacked the capacity to understand voting, had the right to vote. Babies could vote. Animals had the right to vote because they are inhabitants. I don't know if it was specific. I think it said any inhabitants. It didn't say people. So animals had the right to vote in New Jersey. It was a bad law. In New York State, I don't know if this was upon the creation of state and upon the creation of voting laws. The law that I saw was every man over the age of 18 had the right to vote. So that was an example where only men could vote. Now, as I stated before, when you're married, the belief was that you're one person. Both people aren't going to vote so that one could vote one person and one could vote the opposite. They would not do that. It was insane. Today, it's even insane today. If I had a wife and she said she's going to vote Democrat and I was going to vote Republican, I said, let's not go vote. We're just going to cancel each other out. And if she told me, no, I want to vote, and I said, that's idiotic. It's illogical. You will not get the benefit of voting that you think you're going to get. Your vote means zero. It's ideological only. The real meaning is zero. You will not help that person get candidacy if your spouse votes the opposite of you. And if your spouse votes the same as you, it's a double vote. And if you have 100 married couples and the man is the only one that votes, and you've got 100 married couples and they both vote and they both vote the same way, you get the exact same outcome. Nobody is going to, in this time period before the 19th Amendment, nobody's going to say, my wife and I are going to walk to town 10 miles, pay for food at a restaurant for both of us for 3 meals, stay at a hotel for both of us, walk back the next day, maybe have the kids come with us. They weren't idiotic. They weren't going to do something stupid like that. So double voting, the man and the wife voting, made no sense during that time period. There were women that owned property. And there was something that happened. It was a famous case where the woman was suing about the right to vote. And it was because she wasn't married, but she was a property owner. Maybe her husband had died or whatever. I don't remember what it was. But there are cases where women are angry that they didn't have the right to vote for some reason. Or maybe what happened was she was in an intermediary period where her husband owned the property, but her husband died and the property wasn't yet in her name. I don't know what it was, but there was some sort of technicality that she had some issue with voting, that she sued. You can go read about the case. But she wanted to sue. There were women who knew that they had the right to vote and went to vote and voted, and there were women who had the right to vote and were turned back, and you can read about them saying, I went to vote and they turned me away. They said I couldn't vote. There were accusations of fraud with women voting. In Salt Lake City, I believe, was one of the cases where, okay, no, it wasn't Salt Lake City, it was some other city, where men would go and vote, and then they would dress like a woman and try to vote a second time and claim to be their wife. And they were trying to do double voting, and that was one of the things that people did, and it's documented. So they changed the laws to prevent this from happening. They said, okay, no more women voting, just the man's going to vote. And now keep in mind, before this period, anybody could vote. Women didn't vote. They chose not to vote for whatever reason. An agreement they had with their husband, living on their own, they chose not to vote. For whatever reason, the women had the right to vote in many places, and they chose not to. We're talking about state-level voting laws. And some of the laws were changed for different reasons, that the right to vote for women was actually given to them and then taken away. This happened. Now in Utah, in Salt Lake City, you have the Mormons, which believed in polygamy. Now you have an interesting situation because you have a man who could have 5 wives. So now you've got a man with 5 women. That's 6 votes for the family. Now what happened was they didn't want polygamy. Not everyone was a polygamist in Salt Lake City. And the problem is the women did want polygamy. They didn't mind that the husband had 6 wives. It was voluntary. They were not forced into this. They voluntarily married a man who had other wives because they didn't want the other men. Either he was a wealthy man or he had the charisma. They were willing to share a relationship with him, even though he had other wives. And they weren't always often the same age. Usually the ages were spread out. So there would be an older wife, a younger wife, a younger wife, a younger wife, etc. So there was not a divorce. If he didn't like that wife anymore and he found somebody else, it's not like he went out one day and found 6 wives. It happened over a long period of time. The women accepted this behavior, and the people who were anti-polygamist did not want them, they did not want polygamy to be legal. So the problem is, the polygamists, you would have 1 man, 5 women, 6 women, 10 women, those women had large amounts of voting power, so they passed laws in Salt Lake City to prevent them from voting. It wasn't because they didn't want women to have the right to vote. It was because they wanted polygamy to be illegal. That's what Salt Lake City did. Now, when you talk about the right to vote, there's the federal level, the state level, and the local level. And then you've got things that are even smaller than that, like schools. There's never been a federal law denying a woman to vote in the United States. Never existed. Anyone who says that, not true. There have been some states who had the laws, some that didn't, and changing over time. And then you've got the cities. Women dominated voting at the local level, the cities, the school boards, etc. With a vested interest in their immediate community, women were more likely to vote than men, and it's true today. School boards today are dominated by women. Maybe it's changed, but that's the way it was when I was a kid. That's what I read about. I'm in the educational industry. I read about the educational industry to keep up with what's going on. And the dissatisfaction, the complaints that I hear, people that complain about education are women. Men don't complain about education. And these women talk about their experiences dealing with schools. They're the ones that they're the ones that vote at the local level, and they did it for the history of our country. They would go and vote at the local level, and that's a lot of power. People think, oh, well, you're voting at the federal level, you have the most power. It's not true. They vote for who has power over their community, which is the local level. The federal government doesn't dictate educational standards. They don't dictate water and plumbing or electricity. This is all stuff that's done, utilities are done at the local level. Most labor law is at the local level. It's not at the federal level. There's probably federal labor laws, but if you got a problem with labor, you're going to go to your state or the city. The house that you live in is not regulated by the federal government. And I can't think of a single federal regulation for the house that you live in. Where you live is regulated by the city that you live in or the state that you live in. And this is where women dominate voting. That's a lot of power. And women do not acknowledge that they have had voting rights since the creation of this country. There have been some restrictions on women voting for different reasons, some of which may have been sexist, but in general, it wasn't. As I explained, you could say, well, a law that says that only the man over the age of 18 in the state of New York has a right to vote. You could say that it's sexist, but guess what? Open your eyes. In colonial times, there's a lot of women that are not empowered. Today, I can't tell you a single woman who's interested in politics. If I go and talk to a woman about politics, they don't care unless it's a feminist issue or gay rights. They could care less about politics. They don't care about NASA, which is run by the federal government. It's a political issue because it's run by the government. They don't care about what's going on internationally. They don't care about ambassadors. They don't care about embassies. They don't care about the United Nations. They don't care about legislature going in Congress. They don't care. I've gone on dates with women. I like to talk about politics. They don't care. My mother was always telling my father, stop talking about politics. She didn't care. So my belief is that women did not have an interest in voting. And I will prove it to you. They did not have an interest in voting for the history of this country. There's no evidence that they desired the right to vote. Now, the right to vote, you need to be able to read. You need to be able to need access to the media. You need to read newspapers. You need to watch television. You need to listen to the radio. You need transportation. You need to be able to get to the polling place. You need to know where the polling place is. There is a cost. Whether you take public transportation, put gas in your car, ride a horse, you got to feed the horse. You got to feed yourself. There's a cost involved. A lot of factors involved. You have to know what the issues are, which means you can't just show up one day and vote. You have to be aware over the period of time of many weeks or many months of what's going on. You have to care. Knowing what the issues are, you have to actually care about the issues. Most people care about their families. Most people don't care about what's going on in the world, especially throughout the history of the country. Now, The argument that I'm making is that all these factors prevent most people from voting in the early years of our country, including women. Then there was the 19th Amendment. Oh, so before the 19th Amendment, there were women advocating for the right to vote. And they would go around the country and march and protest, because maybe the media, or use the media if they could, but you had to march and protest to get people's attention. They had to do a lot of canvassing to talk to people. And what these women say is that women were not interested in voting in this country. And that's why the movement did not succeed. It took a long time for them to get legislation about voting, which was the 19th Amendment. It didn't happen the year that they started. They had to go to many cities. They were very, very angry. They weren't happy at all about all the work that they went through. They didn't like the fact that they did not make progress. They didn't like the fact that women were not interested. You can read about it on your own. I'm not going to show you any evidence. Go on your own. Go to Wikipedia. Read about the history. There will be other people who will lie to you and say, men prevented women. Not true. Listen to what the women canvassing for voting rights say. They will tell you that women were not interested in voting. They didn't care. So over time, at some point, I don't know if it was the 1920s or 1930s, I don't know when it was. I don't know when the 19th Amendment was passed. You started to have the radio, some literacy, people read, people talked, more people living in urban environments. These people canvassed all over the country. They went all over the place. There's videos of them doing this, so the film age existed. The word was spreading that they wanted this. Eventually, the 19th Amendment was passed. And women will tell you that they didn't have the right to vote until the 19th Amendment. It's not true. There's absolutely nothing in the 19th Amendment that grants them the right to vote. The right to vote, the 19th Amendment is 2 sentences long. It's extremely short. You can go read it. Go read it right now. It does not grant women the right to vote. Women are not mentioned in the 19th Amendment. Females are not mentioned in the 19th Amendment. Men are not mentioned in the 19th Amendment. Males are not mentioned. No gender is mentioned in the 19th Amendment. There's nothing in the 19th Amendment that says that women have the right to vote, or women now have the right to vote, or women cannot be prevented from voting. Does not exist in the 19th Amendment. When a woman says we did not have the right to vote until the 19th Amendment, it's not true. In addition, you've got a hierarchy of laws. You've got the local laws, the state laws, the federal laws. So this is an all-encompassing law. They can make a law granting people voting rights in an amendment that applies to everybody at the federal level, and it applies to the states and the local level, and it becomes universal. The 19th Amendment, go read it, says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on their gender. That's what it says. It doesn't say you now have the right to vote. There's no declaration. So it says you can't prevent someone from voting based on their gender. It applies to men. So if men were denied voting, which probably did happen, I'm sure that there's going to be a case where it happened before the 19th Amendment. At this point, you can no longer prevent them from voting. There were women's-only organizations that existed before the 19th Amendment. The Seneca Falls Conference is one of them, which I will make another video about the Seneca Falls Conference. Feminists and women will tell you about all the great Seneca Falls Conference. Go read it. You will laugh when you read this Seneca Falls Conference. First of all, they were talking about the right to vote. I believe it was in the Seneca Falls Conference, but the problem with it is that women already had the right to vote before the Seneca Falls Conference. It just wasn't true. It might not have had the right to vote in New York, but I don't think they were specific. It's not that long, and it's not a long read, but I don't remember them saying we want the right to vote in New York, we want the right to vote in the federal level. I don't think it was that specific. I think it was just general. So they were unaware of what the facts were. They might not have even known what federal law was at the time. Who did? Why would anybody know the federal laws? There's 7 things in the 7 goals of the Seneca Falls Conference. I'm going to tell you why they're stupid. One of them is they want to prevent women from being in circuses. that was one of them. Do you really think that that's a problem? Were women being forced to be in the circus? But that was one of the things that they thought was important. They wanted the right to go to university, but women had already graduated from universities before the Seneca Falls Conference. So they were asking for a right that they already had. Women were already attending universities. In fact, I think there were already all women's universities before the Seneca Falls Conference. They just didn't know. It was lack of education. They wanted the right. They wanted, in the Seneca Falls Conference, they wanted men to encourage women to speak up in church. This was literally one of the demands of the Seneca Falls Conference. They wanted men to encourage women to speak in church. Makes no sense. You don't need a man to encourage you to speak in church. Motivate yourself. It makes absolutely no sense. If you can tell the man, I want to speak, you're halfway there. You're seriously halfway there. To say, I want you to encourage me to speak makes no sense. Just by telling the man to encourage you to speak, you are halfway there at motivating yourself to speak. The next part is saying what you want to say. The guy might actually say, what do you want to say? I want to say this. So who knows why they said this? Go read it. The Seneca Falls Conference is a laugh. It's nonsense. When women talk about it, they haven't read it. They don't know the nonsense that's in it. So I think I've gone through most of the details about women's voting rights. Women are not honest. They're not telling the truth. I'm sorry. They don't know the truth when they say that they were denied the right to vote. It's not true. You should research this. It's not a long read. Go to Wikipedia, read what it says, accept it as fact, and form your own opinion. Women were prevented in some cases from voting, but there was no universal prevention. Oh, okay, so there's more. There's more to the story. This is where it's going to get really interesting. So the 19th Amendment passed. Women now cannot be denied the right to vote. Guess what? They didn't go vote. There are documents which show the number of people that voted, and they started separating. Before that, they didn't say women and men. What didn't exist. There were women that wanted to vote, and women that even ran for president in the 1800s before the 19th Amendment. Virginia Woolf might have been one of them. I don't know. But there were women over 100 years ago. Hillary Clinton was not the first woman to run for president, or Geraldine Ferraro, or did Bob Dole's wife run for president? I don't remember. So after the 19th Amendment, women didn't vote. Before the 19th Amendment, most voters, at least what's documented, perhaps 100%, were men. After the 19th Amendment, I believe it was 20 years later, which means 4 or 5 elections, before women were voting with equal numbers as men. So for whatever reason, they didn't vote. Either they weren't educated, they didn't know that they could vote, they didn't want to vote, they didn't feel the need to vote, they either had to not know that they could, that the opportunity was there, that they would be accepted, or they lacked the desire. It had to be one of the two. I don't know. We don't know. But what we know from a lot of people that have given testimony, from the women who canvassed, they said the women were not interested in voting. If you look at Saudi Arabian women, and if you ask an American woman about voting rights in Saudi Arabia, they'll tell you that Saudi Arabian women don't have the right to vote, or in Iran. If you go to the news media, they say that Saudi Arabian women don't have the right to vote. Now, in Saudi Arabia, it's ruled by a king. The king makes all the laws. There's no penal code. People don't vote. And not only that, if you ask a Saudi Arabian woman who lives in Saudi Arabia, who's not an American who lives in Saudi Arabia, but a woman who was raised and born in Saudi Arabia, they will tell you they do not want the right to vote. They don't want the right to drive. No, they don't want other women to drive. I know it sounds crazy. It's a story for another video. They're happy. These things that feminists say about women voting in other countries is not true. These women are perfectly happy in the countries that they live in. The problem is that their language is not English. You can't verify what they're saying. I've gone and read everything I could find. I want to see what these people have to say, and I've seen what they say on TV. They disagree with American women about voting rights in their country. I've seen a Kuwaiti woman was on Oprah, and she was a princess. She was a Kuwaiti princess, and she says, we think American women are crazy. We don't agree with them. American women do not know what life is like in our country. We are all treated like princesses. We like the way we live. That is what they said. In Afghanistan, when the war started to get rid of the Taliban, there was a video of a woman learning to drive. And she was with her husband. Her husband was right there, and she was being interviewed. My husband doesn't tell me what to do. I want to learn to drive, and my husband doesn't tell me what to do. And I decided now that I want to learn how to drive. That's what she said, and the husband was right there. And I've heard stories about women that wear burqas, and they say we wear it because we want to. And she also, they say that the husbands don't tell them what to do. They say that they're the ones that rule the house, not the man. This is what foreign women say. Don't believe when American women tell you that other people are denied voting rights around the world. It's just nonsense. Go to the source. Believe what the people who live in those countries say, not what people who live in other countries say, whose source is the media. Go to those people and listen to what they say, and you will get the truth. Okay, so I believe that's everything I've said. There's a lot of misconceptions. You got to use Wikipedia. They cite sources. It's the best information you're going to get. Believe what it says on Wikipedia. The women were not denied the right universally until the 19th Amendment. It's just not true.